Tonight we tiptoe into the moonlit corridors of clandestine deals, Caribbean gold and ships that sail without flags. You're in the year 1776, not on a battlefield lined with drummers and muskets, but in a humid alleyway in Spanish New Orleans. There's a man you don't recognize except for the faint jingle of silver hidden beneath his cloak. He doesn't say much. He slips a satchel to another man who looks like he hasn't slept in 3 days. Their handshake is brief, their nod silent. They disappear in opposite directions. No gunfire, no declarations, just coins, quietly changing the course of history. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the humid dusk of New Orleans in 1776, swatting mosquitoes the size of baby owls and wondering how rebellion in the far-off colonies could possibly involve a place that smells this strongly of tobacco, molasses, and ambition. While you'd expect American revolutionaries to be holed up in Boston or dodging redcoats in the Carolinas, a surprising amount of the action tonight is slipping across docks in Spanish territory. Spain, officially neutral for now, isn't quite sitting this one out. They're watching, they're listening, and most of all, they're spending. Behind closed doors and underneath Baroque ceilings, Spanish officials like Luis de Unzaga and Bernardo de Gálvez are quietly funneling money, munitions, and medical supplies to a ragtag bunch of colonial rebels. They do it through fake merchants, unmarked crates, and secret couriers with the kind of job descriptions that never make it into retirement speeches. Historians still argue whether this early aid was coordinated directly with Madrid, or if it was just local governors playing a dangerous game of let's see what happens if we help. And what they're helping with isn't chump change. These aren't pennies scraped from pockets, they're silver pesos, heavy and real, shipped up the Mississippi River and handed off at shadowy crossroads. You probably won't survive this if you're caught, especially if you're British. These coins come from Spain's New World mines, especially in Mexico and Peru, where indigenous laborers many forced drag silver out of mountains for European monarchs. It's empire-funding rebellion, with irony thick enough to slice. But Spain doesn't hand out help like candy at a parade. They don't want to replace one rebellious colony with another. What they do want is to weaken Britain. Badly. Spain had lost Florida to the British in the last major war, the 7 Years' War, and the sting of that still lingers like a slap from a powdered wig. The Spanish crown wants revenge, but not through loud declarations or fancy uniforms. Not yet. Instead, they begin quietly loosening the screws on the British Empire's machinery. Spain opens its colonial ports to neutral ships that just so happen to carry American flags. They offer safe harbors in the Caribbean. They lose track of cargo that includes rifles, blankets, and barrels of gunpowder. Sometimes a Spanish official just looks the other way, and that tiny moment of selective blindness can change the tide of a battle in Georgia or Virginia. One of the most intriguing operations involves a commercial front known as Roderick Hortalez and Company, a fake merchant enterprise set up with French and Spanish backing to funnel supplies to the American rebels. You've got diplomats turned spies like Pierre Beaumarchais handling logistics and throwing elegant parties to distract British agents while he ships cannonballs in crates labeled glassware. Spain helps fund this too, because when you're rich in gold and discreet in politics, you can do a lot with a shipping manifest and a poker face. You can almost hear the clink of coins in the dark. Picture it, crates of silver hidden beneath sacks of flour, passed hand to hand through the marshy edges of Spanish Louisiana. Men rowing upriver with no questions asked, and sometimes no tongues left to tell tales. It's not just trade, it's wartime whispering with a scent of gunpowder and oranges. The irony here is thick. The American colonies, built under British flags and stocked with Protestant sermons, are being bankrolled in part by a staunchly Catholic monarchist empire on another continent. Spain isn't a fan of democracy, but they are fans of British discomfort. It's one of those alliances you don't put on a postcard. Everyone involved is just pretending not to notice each other's political contradictions. And all this is happening while Spain is officially neutral. That's the best part. They're not in the war, not yet. So every barrel sent, every peso delivered is part of the shadow campaign aid, without acknowledgement assistance, without alliance. It's like funding your neighbor's lawsuit against your shared enemy, but leaving no fingerprints on the envelope. One fringe tidbit. Spanish couriers sometimes disguised themselves as musicians, slipping past checkpoints with fiddles and sheet music, hiding dispatches and coded messages. Picture a violinist in breeches, charming British officers with a sonata, while quietly coordinating a gunpowder delivery 2 towns over. That's the kind of multitasking school never prepares you for. As you lie back and think about those ships moving silently through Gulf waters, carrying the weight of revolution, not just in ideals, but in literal bars of silver. Remember, not all wars are won with drums and flags. Some are won with a quiet nod, a hidden ledger, and a bag of Spanish coins passed in the dark. You wake up to the sound of gulls and the smell of salt and burnt sugar, your boots sinking into the soggy edges of the Mississippi River Delta. Spanish Louisiana, they call it, though you'd barely know it's Spain, unless someone pointed at a flag. But the man running this show, Governor Bernardo de Gálvez, doesn't care much for formalities. He's far more interested in playing the British like a fiddle, and tonight the strings are taut. Gálvez is in his early 30s, energetic, charming, and fluent in backroom deals, the kind of man who serves wine with one hand and signs invasion orders with the other. Officially, Spain still isn't part of the American Revolutionary War, but unofficially he's got a to-do list that includes sabotaging British supply lines, funneling weapons to rebels, and winning a few secret battles no one will ever properly thank him for. He sets up supply networks stretching from Havana to New Orleans to St. Louis. If you're fighting for American independence and your musket's in working condition, there's a decent chance it came through Gálvez's invisible network. Blankets, medicine, uniforms, all quietly shipped through Spanish ports and handed off like contraband cigars. Historians still debate whether Gálvez acted with full clearance from Madrid in those early moves, or whether he was freelancing armed with charm guts and just enough bureaucratic wiggle room to claim ignorance if needed. By 1777, Gálvez gets bolder. He organizes shipments of gunpowder up the Mississippi River to supply George Rogers Clark's campaigns in the western frontier. And he doesn't stop there. He hosts trading parties where mysterious American guests just happen to pick up military-grade supplies. You attend one of these yourself. In this dreamlike haze, there's music and dancers, and whole roasted pigs, and somewhere between dessert and diplomacy, a few crates of rifles slip into rebel hands. The British are never formally invited, but eventually throwing parties isn't enough. The British begin sniffing around Spanish territory, trying to shut down the southern supply lines. Gálvez, not one to wait around, decides he's done playing host and starts playing general. His first target, the British forts along the lower Mississippi, Baton Rouge, Natchez, and others. These aren't massive fortresses, but strategic outposts controlling river trade and threatening Spain's colonial assets. In September 1779, without waiting for British permission or even formal US thanks, Gálvez gathers a ragtag army of Spanish regulars, free black soldiers, Native American allies, and even a few American frontiersmen who don't ask too many questions. He marches them through swamps so thick you can taste the mud. Mosquitoes swarm like clouds, the food spoils by the second day, and half the soldiers get sick. You trudge with them in your mind, tired, itchy, and already regretting your life choices. Still, the man pushes forward. When they reach Fort Butte, the British barely put up a fight. A few cannon blasts and the fort surrenders. One down, then Baton Rouge. This one's tougher. There's real resistance, real blood. But after hours of artillery, the British give in. The Spanish flag rises over the ruins. Quirky detail. Gálvez's army drags its cannon through the swamp, using sugar barrels for flotation. That's right, rum-soaked sugar barrels repurposed as makeshift pontoons. Every inch of victory comes with the smell of dessert and gunpowder. From there, the victories start to snowball. With each fort that falls, Gálvez secures not just land but leverage. The British, expecting Spain to stay on the sidelines, now find their Gulf flank collapsing like a soggy flan. And all of this is happening while Spain still hasn't officially declared war on Britain. Not until June 1779 does Spain openly enter the war, by which point Gálvez is already halfway done winning it in the Gulf region. Meanwhile, British commanders are baffled. Their maps say Spain is neutral, their reports say otherwise. Spanish civilians turn out to be armed. Spanish port inspectors wave through entire shipments of rebel supplies. And Gálvez himself, always polite, always smiling, and always 10 steps ahead. Historians still debate how coordinated Gálvez was with American leaders like Washington and Franklin. Some believe he kept in close contact through coded messages and emissaries. Others think he operated more independently, supporting the rebellion as a way to weaken Britain while protecting Spanish imperial interests. Either way, his fingerprints are all over the logistics behind major frontier victories. The British begin to realize they're not just fighting 13 colonies, they're fighting an expanding, unpredictable web of enemies, including an empire that refuses to play by the standard rules of war. Gálvez's moves don't make headlines in Philadelphia or London, but on the ground they shape the war's geography, cutting off British reinforcements, isolating loyalist strongholds, and opening up supply lines that keep American resistance alive. And back in New Orleans, the parties keep happening. The music keeps playing, guests come and go, but under the polished wood floors in the candlelit corners of wine cellars, the real work continues. Couriers depart at dusk with sealed orders. Ships leave port with crates labeled saltfish, but filled with lead shot. And Gálvez. He raises a glass to another quiet victory. No headlines, no parades, just another step in Spain's shadow war. You rest your head tonight knowing that while some revolutions shout, others whisper, and that somewhere in the humid heart of Spanish Louisiana, a man with a wide-brimmed hat and a half-smile is changing history with each silent handshake. You squint through the candlelit haze of a smoky parlor in Paris where Benjamin Franklin sips wine and plays chess with European nobles who pretend not to stare at his fur cap. It's the late 1770s and Franklin has been in France for months, charming salons and angling for aid. Everyone knows France is itching to slap Britain again after their last imperial brawl, but Franklin is also working another angle, Spain. Spain and France are cousins in crowns and cautious conspirators in politics. The Bourbon family compact ties their fates together, but Spain isn't as eager to throw its troops into a messy, uncertain rebellion. The Spanish court, led by King Charles III, is hesitant. They want to hurt Britain, sure, but they also want to avoid revolution's contagious whiff. Supporting liberty? Fine. Encouraging it near Madrid? Absolutely not. So Spain sends signals instead of soldiers, coins instead of cannons, at least at first. And here in this in-between moment of diplomacy and subterfuge, Franklin begins to work through Spanish bankers, diplomats, and the occasional secret backdoor. There are whispers that the American cause could use just a bit more help, just a few more coins. Not too flashy, just enough to turn the tide. One of the turning points comes in 1781. The American cause is faltering. Troops are underpaid, undersupplied, and more often than not undernourished. Washington knows he needs one final blow to end this thing. And Yorktown, that's the target. Trap Cornwallis, surround him, and maybe the British will call it quits. But that kind of operation needs serious money boat supplies men. And at this point, the American treasury is emptier than a colonial tavern at sunrise. Enter Havana. Yes, that Havana, the jewel of Spain's Caribbean empire, filled with sugar plantations, Spanish forts, and vaults stocked with silver. You step off a creaky ship and onto sun-soaked cobblestones, passing mule-drawn carts loaded with crates that clink like church bells in an earthquake. These are the silver pesos, thousands of them gathered from Cuban elites and colonial officials, some donated voluntarily, others encouraged by royal suggestion. This money, known to history as La Donación de la Habana, becomes the emergency cash infusion that makes Yorktown possible. When Washington and French General Rochambeau prepare their siege, it's Spanish silver gathered in the Caribbean and rushed north that pays for the final push. Without it, historians agree, the siege might have stalled. Ships might not have sailed. Soldiers might have mutinied from hunger. But with it, the noose tightens around Cornwallis. Historians still argue whether Spain intended that donation to directly fund Yorktown or whether it was meant for more general support. But what's undeniable is that it got there in time, and it made a difference. You picture a Spanish courier galloping across the colonies, the saddlebag full of pesos slapping against his thigh, not knowing that inside is the death warrant for British ambitions in America. And you know who noticed? Not the Americans, oddly. The US Congress, distracted and half-broke, barely sends a thank you note. France gets the statues. France gets the oaths of brotherhood. Spain gets a nod if that. But among European elites, everyone knows the truth. Spain funded a revolution without embracing it. One little-known story even suggests that Franklin, while sipping wine with Spanish envoys, would subtly raise his eyebrows whenever they asked if American independence would really catch on. Oh, who can say he'd mumble before casually sliding them a list of supply needs as long as a French baguette. And the funds didn't just go to soldiers. They went to printing presses to feed rebellious pamphlets into British-held towns. They paid for medicine to keep wounded rebels from dying in the mud. They paid for gunpowder quietly shipped under neutral flags through Caribbean ports like Cap Francais and Port of Spain. Every peso stretched across a continent of need. One fringe tidbit. A shipment of Spanish silver meant for American troops reportedly vanished off the Carolina coast, and legends say it still lies buried beneath the sand dunes, guarded by crabs and salt air. Local treasure hunters swear by it, and more than one sleepy southern beach town has a bar named the Silver Peso. Is it real? Who knows? But if you're ever walking along the shore near Charleston and you stub your toe on something heavy, you might want to dig. What's certain is this: when you trace the path of the revolution's biggest victories, there's often a quiet Spanish coin at the center. Franklin may have been the public face and France the loud patron, but Spain was the banker behind the curtain. They preferred whispers over parades and vaults over victory speeches. As you drift towards sleep, picture this: a ship bobbing in Havana's harbor, its hold stuffed with silver and dreams. Lanterns sway on deck. The crew doesn't sing. They sail under no name, no banner. But in their quiet voyage lies the weight of a world about to shift. The morning fog curls low across the Gulf Coast, and you find yourself standing at the edge of a swampy shoreline that doesn't show up in most war atlases. You're not in Philadelphia, you're not in Saratoga, you're in the thick, sticky backdoor of British North America, West Florida. Here in the land of palmettos, sandflies and long-forgotten forts, Spain is about to stage one of the most quietly effective distractions in the entire American Revolution. Now that Spain has officially entered the war, as of 1779, Governor Bernardo de Gálvez doesn't need to play pretend anymore. No more subtle crates marked candles that somehow smell like gunpowder. No more smiling politely at British merchants while shipping supplies upriver to George Rogers Clark. No. Now Gálvez goes full general, and he's got his sights set on British-controlled Florida, both west and east. Why Florida? Because while the American rebels are pushing the British up north, Gálvez realizes that punching them from below could do more than just irritate. It could break their concentration. It's like pinching someone's ankle in a bar fight. Unexpected, undignified, and wildly effective. So in 1780, he gathers his troops: Spanish regulars, Native American allies, French volunteers, free black and mixed-race soldiers, and even some rogue American frontiersmen. He's assembling one of the most diverse revolutionary forces in the hemisphere, and they're not marching, they're slogging through mangroves, mosquito clouds, and tropical storms. They inch toward the British stronghold of Mobile. The British don't expect it. Who would try to fight a siege surrounded by crocodiles and mud thick enough to eat your horse? But Gálvez isn't looking for convenience, he's looking for pressure. And when Fort Charlotte in Mobile falls in early 1780 after a short siege, the British realize something alarming: their southern flank is gone. It's like leaving your back door open while someone's already breaking into the front. Still, Gálvez isn't satisfied. His eyes now turn toward Pensacola, the capital of British West Florida, and the strongest British position on the Gulf Coast. It's heavily fortified, well-stocked, and defended by both British regulars and loyalist militias. Taking it won't be easy. He'll need ship's siege weapons and just enough divine luck to avoid dying of yellow fever. But first, the setup. Gálvez understands that by attacking Florida, he's doing more than just conquering land. He's forcing Britain to divide its military attention. Troops that might have gone to reinforce Cornwallis in Virginia or defend Canada are suddenly stuck sweating in subtropical uniforms waiting for a Spanish cannonball to rip through their barracks. This is the kind of military distraction that doesn't show up on the fireworks reels, but shifts the momentum of the war nonetheless. Historians still debate how strategically coordinated this southern campaign was with the American generals in the north. Some say Washington and Gálvez shared intel through intermediaries, others suggest their goals just happened to align. Either way, while the world watched battles at Trenton and Yorktown, Gálvez quietly carved out an entire theater of victory in the Gulf. And all the while, Gálvez kept one very important detail in mind: the French fleet was arriving soon to help the Americans, and Cornwallis was starting to feel cornered in Yorktown. What Britain didn't need was a second front crumbling at the exact same time, so Gálvez timed his Pensacola campaign like a maestro. The drums of war in the north were about to reach a crescendo, and he was planning the percussion from the south. You can almost hear the British commanders groaning at their war maps. They'd already underestimated the Americans. Then France joined in. Now Spain was knocking on Florida's door. This wasn't an uprising anymore, it was a multi-continental migraine. Quirky detail. In one of the skirmishes before the siege, a Spanish gunner supposedly fired a cannon that struck a British officer's teacup during breakfast. Whether it's true or just campfire legend, it shows how surreal and theatrical war in the tropics could be polite manners and explosions all in the same 10 minutes. Gálvez prepares for the big push. Siege plans are drawn, ships are fitted with heavy guns, and deep in the Spanish Caribbean reinforcements gather troops from Cuba, Puerto Rico, and even parts of Central America. This isn't just Spain helping America anymore. It's Spain rolling out its imperial war machine complete with flags, fanfare, and field drums. But here's the twist: even though this campaign won't end until 1781, nearly in tandem with the American triumph at Yorktown, it doesn't get celebrated in Philadelphia. Most Americans never hear about Pensacola or Mobile. They don't know that Spain was tying up thousands of British soldiers, burning British supplies, and capturing forts while American troops were short on shoes. And yet this distraction mattered. It fractured Britain's global war effort. It forced their hand in diplomacy. And it meant that when Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, there were fewer reinforcements, fewer options, and far less hope for the Redcoats. So as you lie here, cocooned in blankets, think of Gálvez somewhere in the Floridian wilds, swatting mosquitoes the size of pigeons and sketching siege diagrams in the sand. He's not doing it for applause. He's not doing it for independence. He's doing it because weakening Britain is worth 100 muddy boots and 1,000 sleepless nights. And for a revolution built on fragile alliances, that kind of distraction is priceless. You drift through a foggy harbor where the moonlight kisses the crests of waves and cloaks the ships below in a veil of mystery. There are no flags here, just creaking wood-whispered orders and crates that no one is supposed to ask about. This isn't a battlefield or a courtroom. This is the realm of letters without return addresses, of shipments that sail without names, and of Spain's shadow diplomacy, a network so quiet it barely left fingerprints. Even after Spain officially entered the war in 1779, much of its support for the American rebels remained indirect, unspoken, and intentionally deniable. You're watching dispatches being loaded onto sloops in the dark, written in cipher, tucked in double-waxed envelopes handed to couriers who know to burn them before capture. If you're caught with one, you might as well be wearing a red coat and shouting, "Viva Washington!" Spain mastered the art of aiding without admitting. Unlike France, which entered the war with muskets blazing and uniforms crisp, Spain kept playing its older, more subtle game, pressuring Britain through alternate fronts while keeping its name off the guest list. It's like writing checks to your neighbor's enemy while smiling at their dinner parties. Most of the communication between Spain and the American revolutionaries came not through grand ambassadors or formal treaties, but through intermediaries, merchants, bankers, diplomats' assistants, and the occasional double agent whose job title was something like special courier, but whose actual job involved more swamp treks and pistol duels than office work. These figures operated from Cuba to New Orleans to Philadelphia, often sailing under neutral flags or fabricated identities. One of the central arteries of this invisible support system was the Spanish port of Bilbao. American agents there posed as Dutch traders, French merchants, or even Italian bookkeepers. They coordinated with sympathetic Spanish bankers who, while officially neutral, managed to accidentally lend vast sums of money to buyers who bore an uncanny resemblance to American envoys. Historians still argue whether the Spanish crown directly authorized these transactions or simply allowed them to happen with a meaningful shrug. But one thing's for sure, Spain's commercial and diplomatic channels worked overtime. Gunpowder shipments moved under bills of lading that declared them to be olive oil. Rifles were shipped as farm tools, cannonballs became maritime ballast, and sometimes the crates weren't labelled at all. You picture a British inspector cracking one open and blinking at the cache of musket barrels before being told, "Ah yes, ceremonial curtain rods." Spain's own intelligence service, never quite as flamboyant as France's, was still deeply involved. They monitored British troop movements in the Caribbean, shared that intel with American forces when possible, and occasionally sent their own saboteurs to disrupt loyalist supply chains. In Havana, a small circle of agents worked out of candlelit offices organizing messages and relays, their fingers ink-stained and burned from sealing wax. One particularly strange but true detail: some dispatches were written in lemon juice and only became visible when gently heated over a flame. Spanish operatives used this trick to send instructions between Havana and Philadelphia. The problem, of course, was that colonial fireplaces weren't always gentle. More than one letter became a small pile of very patriotic ash. And then there were the phantom ships vessels that seemed to appear just when needed, carrying food, medicine, or ammunition, then vanishing without a trace. These were often privateers under Spanish protection, or hired smugglers sailing from places like Cartagena or Veracruz. They'd avoid British patrols using local knowledge of reefs and islands guided by moonlight and memory. It was messy, it was inconsistent, but it worked. The flow of goods wasn't always reliable, but it kept just enough men fed, just enough gunpowder dry, and just enough hope alive. And at every step, plausible deniability hovered like a fog. If a ship was captured, the documents were either blank, falsified, or mysteriously missing. If a courier was seized, they usually knew just enough to sound stupid, not treasonous. This deep ambiguity was intentional. Spain didn't want to give Britain an excuse to expand the war even further. Charles III still had to manage colonies across Latin America, Asia, and North Africa. Stirring up open rebellion in one place could ignite others. So Spain walked a razor-thin line, helping the American cause just enough to hurt Britain, but not enough to accidentally inspire the same revolution in, say, Peru or Manila. And here's a quirky fringe tidbit for you. In at least one case, an American agent in Spain used a fake wine business as a cover operation for funneling coded messages and small shipments of supplies. The wine was real, but the labels often had messages in invisible ink, and the barrels occasionally included more musket balls than Merlot. The operation ended only when an actual wine merchant bought a crate by mistake and received what must have been the world's most disappointing vintage. So tonight, as you drift, let your thoughts float with one of those phantom ships. No flag, no name, just a dim lantern swaying above a hold full of quiet rebellion. You don't know who owns the ship or who paid for the powder. All you know is that it's sailing into the wind with purpose, and that somewhere, in a parlor, in Madrid, or a back alley, in Cadiz, someone just nodded, knowing their role in a revolution no one would ever thank them for. You lean against the stone wall of a grand hall in Paris. The year is 1783, and the room smells of pipe smoke, perfume, and polished shoes, because peace is finally on the table. The American Revolution is winding down, and diplomats are drafting what will become the Treaty of Paris. Everyone's smiling, toasting, congratulating each other in every known language with champagne and awkward hugs. France is basking in the glow of having helped birth a new republic. Franklin's grinning like a man who just won a chess match using only pawns. And Spain is standing quietly near the buffet, wondering why no one's mentioning the fact they picked up a big part of the tab. Let's get one thing clear. France absolutely deserved applause. French troops fought and died at Yorktown. Their navy bottled up the British and helped force Cornwallis to surrender. But Spain poured in more silver, captured more territory, and opened more fronts without ever making it about themselves. They weren't in it for the clout, they were in it to make Britain bleed. And bleed, Britain did. Spain took back Florida. They hammered British forts from the Mississippi to the Caribbean. They poured cash into the rebel war chest, often without a receipt. But when the time came for celebration, they let France take the limelight. Historians still argue whether this was strategic humility or diplomatic negligence. After all, visibility gets you leverage, and Spain got less than they arguably earned. In fact, during the treaty negotiations, Spain was more interested in recovering lost territories like Gibraltar than basking in the afterglow of American liberty. And while they did get Florida back, Gibraltar remained stubbornly British, like a bad tattoo that wouldn't fade. Spain had laid siege to it during the war in one of the longest, most intense artillery bombardments Europe had ever seen. But Gibraltar held. And for Charles III, that stung more than all the thankless coin shipments to George Washington. Meanwhile, the American delegates didn't exactly go out of their way to thank Spain. They were too busy trying to finalize their borders, secure fishing rights, and pretend they were already a major power. Spain, ever cautious, had never officially recognized American independence during the war, fearing it might inspire its own colonies to follow suit. So when the treaty came around, there wasn't a warm, brotherly handshake between Spain and the newborn US, just polite nods and some awkward silence. Still, Spain had changed the outcome of the war in ways few fully appreciated. Gálvez's Gulf victories meant Britain had to split its forces. Spanish silver, some from taxes, some from donations, funded campaigns the Continental Congress could never afford. And Spain's military distractions helped stretch British supply lines thin as paper. Without those factors, Cornwallis might have had more reinforcements, and Yorktown might have been a footnote instead of a finale. But Spain didn't host parades. There were no Galvezbergs or San Carlosvilles popping up on US maps. And at those elegant victory banquets in France, Spain's representatives often ended up seated somewhere near the musicians. It's the international equivalent of paying for dinner and not getting a bite of dessert. Quirky detail. In Madrid, a few artists were commissioned to paint scenes of Spanish victories in the Americas, complete with dramatic skies, triumphant generals, and burning British forts. But these paintings were rarely displayed outside court circles. Most of them were tucked away in dusty galleries viewed by nobles who applauded softly and then changed the subject. One painting of Gálvez entering Pensacola with a raised sword was reportedly used to cover a wine stain on a palace wall for 20 years. So much for glory. Still, Spain's approach wasn't about parading ideals like liberty or democracy. They weren't inspired by Thomas Paine or Jefferson. Spain was playing empire chess. They saw an opening to weaken Britain, secure territory, and protect their colonial investments. And in many ways they succeeded. Florida returned to Spanish hands. British dominance in the Americas took a body blow. And Spain showed that you could shape a war's outcome without leading every charge. Historians still puzzle over Spain's relative silence in the revolutionary aftermath. Was it strategic caution, a reluctance to share the spotlight with upstart Republicans, or just a failure of political PR? One thing's clear: by the time the cannons cooled and the treaties were signed, Spain had done much of the dirty work, quietly, thoroughly, and without applause. So tonight, as you roll deeper into sleep, picture a long banquet table. At one end, Franklin clinks glasses with French diplomats beneath glittering chandeliers. At the far corner, a Spanish envoy picks at cold meat quietly, tallying how many ships, how many men, how many pesos they spent, while everyone else forgets who bought the wine. You sail now through storm-churned waters, salt spray stinging your cheeks and cannon barrels slick with rain. The year is 1782, and somewhere in the minds of Spanish officials, perhaps even King Charles III himself, a bold, secretive thought flickers. What if Spain launched another armada, not like the one that sank off English shores in 1588, soaked in hubris and hurricane, but a newer, quieter, more efficient fleet, one that could blockade Britain's coast and finish what Yorktown had started? Sounds dramatic, maybe even desperate. But at this point in the war with Britain, reeling, Spain has momentum. They've taken back Florida, harassed British forts in the Caribbean, and besieged Gibraltar for years. So why not strike harder? Why not finally break British naval dominance? And just maybe while France and the new United States are busy counting their blessings, Spain could land the decisive blow and claim the credit. Historians still argue whether this proposed armada was ever meant to sail or whether it was merely a diplomatic bluff, a move to pressure Britain at the negotiating table, like pushing all your poker chips forward without showing your cards. Either way, the planning wasn't just a fantasy. Spanish admirals met in Cadiz, orders were drafted, supply lines were whispered about, ships were assembled, sails stitched, and maps inked with ghost routes toward British shores. But as always, reality wasn't in the mood to cooperate. Spain's naval strength, while formidable, was stretched thin. The siege of Gibraltar was still consuming shipsmen and morale like a bottomless furnace. The Caribbean needed constant protection from British privateers. And while Spain had capable admirals, they didn't have the kind of naval coordination that France had fine-tuned by 1781. Plus, winter storms near the English Channel had not gotten any friendlier since 1588. Neptune, it seems, still had a bias. Still, the plan hung in the air. The British certainly believed it was possible. In London, rumours swirled of a coming joint Spanish-French invasion. Panic touched Parliament. Coastal towns nervously rechecked their fortifications. One satirical newspaper ran a cartoon showing Charles III sailing toward Dover in a wine barrel sabre raised yelling about revenge. The punchline was that no one believed he'd make it past the fog. But behind the satire was a real fear. What if Spain was serious? What if the quiet power that had propped up the American rebellion from behind veils and couriers decided it was time to act in daylight? Britain knew it was vulnerable, its navy had suffered defeats, its finances were in shambles, and its enemies were multiplying like rabbits in a carrot field. One particularly odd historical tidbit. Some of Spain's proposed fleet movements included launching a diversionary attack on Liverpool, not London, not Portsmouth, but Liverpool. The idea was that the British wouldn't expect it, and it would deal a harsh blow to British merchant interests. It's unclear how far that idea went, but imagine the look on a Liverpool dockworker's face if a Spanish galleon had rolled into the Mersey like it was just popping in for tea. And then the plan fizzled. Too many risks, too few ships, too much uncertainty. The war was winding down, peace negotiations were moving forward in Paris. And while Spain wanted to weaken Britain, they didn't want to overplay their hand. Launching another armada, even a modern one, could have backfired spectacularly. Lose and you look like a fool. Win and you spook your French allies, your American quasi-friends, and possibly your own colonies. So the Grand Armada never sails. The ships are reassigned, the maps are shelved, the orders are quietly burned. And the whole episode slips into history's fog, half plan, half dream, half threat. Still, it leaves an impression. Because even without sailing, the idea of another Spanish armada echoes through the halls of diplomacy. It forces Britain to act a little quicker at the negotiation table. It reminds France that Spain isn't just playing backup vocals, and it whispers to the Americans, already forgetting their benefactors, that another empire still looms just offstage, quiet but watching. You can almost hear the creak of wooden hulls that never left harbour, the salt air that never tasted gunpowder, the gulls circling empty decks. Spain never needed to sail that fleet. The idea alone had power, and so tonight, As you settle into deeper rest, picture that phantom armada floating on glassy water beneath a moonlit sky, silent, ready, and forever anchored in the what-if. You wade ankle-deep through warm, reedy waters near a coastline that smells like seaweed, gunpowder, and oranges left too long in the sun. Above you, black smoke swirls into a low, Floridian sky as cannon fire echoes from the bluffs. This is Pensacola in 1781, and the man leading the siege isn't Washington or Lafayette or even a continental officer. It's Bernardo de Gálvez again, now elevated to general and governor of Spanish Louisiana, still smiling, still storming fortresses with more grit than backup. The siege of Pensacola is his boldest move yet, the target. The last major British stronghold in West Florida, and one of the most heavily fortified outposts on the Gulf Coast. The British dug in here like ticks surrounding their position, with wooden walls, redoubts, and a crescent-shaped harbour protected by gun batteries that look down on any would-be invader with contempt. But Gálvez has waited long enough. After Mobile, after Baton Rouge, this is the crown jewel, and he wants it. First, he gathers his fleet. Ships from Cuba, New Orleans, and other Spanish Caribbean colonies converge near Pensacola Bay, forming a small but determined flotilla. Spanish Marines, French artillerymen, Afro-Cuban militia, Choctaw and Creek warriors, even some defecting Hessians. It's like the United Nations of 18th century grudges against Britain. The weather, of course, isn't cooperating. A hurricane slams the Gulf just as Gálvez sets sail, scattering ships and ruining timetables. His officers beg him to wait, retreat, try again later. But you've met Gálvez by now. Waiting is not in his vocabulary. So what does he do? He grabs a lantern, rows ahead of the fleet himself, and sails directly into the mouth of Pensacola Bay aboard his flagship, Gálvez Town, essentially shouting across the waves, "If I can do it, so can you." His commanders are stunned. His soldiers are inspired. The fleet follows. Historians still debate whether this was true bravery or reckless showboating. But one fact is clear: it worked. The Spanish entered the bay, dropped anchor, and began one of the most overlooked sieges in the entire war. It drags on for weeks. The British have numbers, fortifications, and good high ground, but the Spanish have determination and a few lucky cannon shots. One fired from an inland battery hastily constructed by Gálvez's engineers manages to strike a British powder magazine dead on. Boom. The explosion rips through a key bastion, creating chaos and cracking morale. Spanish troops charge through the breach, muskets raised and banners flying. The British hang on for a few more days, but by May 1781 they surrender. Gálvez enters Pensacola not as a conqueror, but as a man who just dismantled Britain's last defense in the south with one of the most diverse forces ever assembled in the Revolution. He secures over 1,000 British prisoners, reclaims Florida for Spain, and essentially ends Britain's Gulf ambitions in one fell swoop. And yet, hardly a whisper about it in American textbooks. While Yorktown grabs headlines, while Washington's statue is getting sculpted, Gálvez's victory is politely set aside. After all, it doesn't fit the neat narrative of 13 colonies rising alone. A Spanish general liberating Florida that's not in the Schoolhouse Rock version. Fringe detail. Gálvez was later awarded the title Count of Gálvez and even given the motto Yo Solo, meaning I alone, a reference to his daring sail into Pensacola Bay. The phrase was emblazoned on his coat of arms, which also includes a lion, a tower, and a cannonball for good measure. A man of subtlety, clearly. And here's a curious modern twist. Gálvez was eventually granted honorary U.S. citizenship by Congress in 2014. Yes, over 2 centuries later, the United States finally went, oh right, that guy basically liberated the southern flank of our revolution. Thanks, Bernardo. A little late, but nice gesture. So here you are again in the thick of smoke and swamp, watching as Spanish troops cheer beneath a rising sun. Pensacola is theirs. Florida is Spain's once more. The British are out and the chessboard of empire has shifted, quietly, effectively, without a single line in the Declaration of Independence mentioning it. As you drift further into sleep, you imagine Gálvez standing on a Pensacola bluff, boots muddy, coat scorched but eyes bright. He doesn't need statues or speeches, just the salty wind, the crack of Spanish banners, and the knowledge that his silent campaign helped break an empire from the bottom up. The war has ended, the cannons fall silent, and you find yourself strolling through a town where the flags have changed, but the dust still settles the same. It's 1783 and the United States is basking in its newfound independence, but Spain's role in this revolution feels more like a whisper lost in the roaring crowd. America didn't send much in the way of gratitude to Spain. No grand parades, no statues unveiled, barely a mention in speeches. You almost want to pull a face at the thankless kids on the block. Spain, on the other hand, is quietly reclaiming what it considers rightfully theirs. Florida, a prize lost to Britain decades earlier, returns to Spanish control. Yet there's no joyous ceremony broadcast across the colonies. Spain's reclaimed territory is its consolation prize for all the silver soldiers and subterfuge spent during the war. The Bourbon monarchy, pragmatic as ever, considers it a diplomatic win but not a revolutionary triumph. This awkward thank you moment is complicated by the fact that Spain never fully recognized American independence during the war, fearful of the spark it might ignite in its own vast empire. So when the peace treaties were signed, Spain's priorities leaned more toward restoring its own colonial holdings than forging an alliance with the young republic. The new Americans, for their part, were preoccupied with internal governance, westward expansion, and a handful of rebellions that suggested their work was far from over. And so despite Spain's crucial role in undermining British power, the post-war relationship between the two nations was cool at best. No official alliances formed, no joint celebrations held, just a quiet agreement to keep watching each other carefully. Historians still debate whether Spain's reluctance to embrace American independence stemmed from genuine imperial caution or a missed diplomatic opportunity. Spain also found itself tangled in other struggles. Gibraltar remained in British hands despite lengthy sieges, a frustrating thorn in Spain's side. The recovery of Florida was a bittersweet triumph, shadowed by the empire's worries over its other colonies. The Caribbean, Central America, and South America were restless, watching and waiting. Supporting the American Revolution had been a gamble with ripple effects far beyond the Atlantic. Quirky detail. After the war, some British loyalists fled to Florida and found themselves under Spanish rule. Some even switched loyalties, blending into Spanish colonial society with surprising ease. Letters from the period reveal British officers complaining that Spanish governors treated them too kindly, even hosting banquets in their honor. It's like an awkward family reunion where everyone's pretending nothing exploded last decade. In Washington, there might have been a faint hope Spain would become a reliable ally, but the reality was more complicated. Spain prioritized its empire's stability over revolutionary ideals. The young American Republic would have to find its own path forward. So as you settle into the quiet hum of night, picture Spain, stepping back into the shadows of empire, nursing its recovered lands and nursing its bruised pride. They had changed history-shaped continents and bankrolled rebellion, yet the gratitude they received was as elusive as the dawn mist over the Florida swamps. It's a tale of unspoken debts and forgotten victories, a revolution within a revolution, and a reminder that not all heroes get their day in the sun. You stand now in a quiet sunlit plaza somewhere in Spain, the air heavy with the scent of aged stone orange blossoms and bourbon barrels long emptied. The revolution is over, history is written, and the spotlight has dimmed, leaving behind the quiet dust of empires, shifting and fading. Spain's role in the American Revolution, once wrapped in secrecy, silver and silent cannon fire, is now buried in ledgers, cracked fort walls and statues that no one quite remembers to dust. The legacy is complicated. While France gets the glory and the United States claims the independence, Spain remains the quiet architect behind the scenes, pulling strings without asking for applause. Their shadow war reshaped the continent's future, but left little mark on popular memory. That statue of Bernardo de Gálvez, the Count of Gálvez, stands modestly in Washington, D.C. today, nearly dwarfed by monuments to generals whose names dominate history books. It's a quiet reminder of the empire that chose to fund a revolution without signing its name to the petition. Spain's victory in reclaiming Florida restored some pride, but it also underscored the bittersweet nature of their involvement. They helped birth a nation that would one day eclipse their own empire's reach. And while they won battles in the Caribbean and the Gulf, the costs of empire-distant colonies, rebellious provinces, and costly sieges like Gibraltar still loomed large. They had won the war, but not the peace of mind. Historians still argue about Spain's motivations. Was it pragmatic empire politics, cautious realpolitik, or a genuine sympathy for the revolutionary cause? Probably a mix of all three, layered with the messy realities of 18th century diplomacy and empire. Spain had to protect its interests, avoid inspiring revolutions at home, and keep an eye on the sprawling territories that made it a global power. Helping the American colonies was a strategic chess move, not a heartfelt embrace of democracy. There's a certain poetry to it. Spain, an empire built on conquest and control, quietly funding rebellion elsewhere, not to free the oppressed, but to break a rival. The revolutionaries depended on Spanish silver as much as on French muskets. And yet the story is rarely told with the detail and warmth it deserves. One quirky anecdote to close legend has it that after the war, a Spanish diplomat gifted George Washington a ceremonial sword engraved with the phrase "Por la patria y la libertad," for country and liberty. Washington reportedly kept it on display, a quiet nod to an ally who never quite got his due in the history books. So as you sink deeper into your pillow, imagine that sword resting on a mantle gleaming softly in the firelight, a symbol of a revolution funded by shadow strategy and silent gold. A reminder that history is never just the loudest voice in the room, but often the quietest. Let the dust settle now. Let the night fold around you like a soft blanket. The story is done, but the echoes remain whispering through the ages, telling of a secret support that helped change the world. The long night stretches before you, the world outside hushed and still, and you feel the gentle pull of sleep weaving its calm around your thoughts. The flickering candlelight of history's hidden corners softens into a warm glow as the busy footsteps of revolution fade to a whisper. Spain's secret role in the American Revolution is like a quiet river beneath a roaring waterfall, always there, shaping the landscape even when no one looks. You breathe deeply and let the rhythm of the past soothe you, the clink of silver coins fading into the steady pulse of distant waves. The clash of muskets and cannon fire dissolves into the hush of a peaceful night. Somewhere in the shadows unseen, hands have guided the course of nations, their work complete and unheralded. Rest now. The world keeps turning, empires rise and fall, but the stories, especially the quiet ones, linger in the spaces between moments. Let the weight of history cradle you soft and steady as your eyelids grow heavy and dreams begin to bloom. Tonight, the past is your lullaby. Spain's silent support, its hidden battles, its forgotten victories, all fold gently into the darkness, carrying you to a place where history sleeps, and so can you.